We have the answer. It's Resurrection Sunday. We're going to be looking at John chapter 11, chapter 14, and chapter 20 this morning. And this is the final in our Easter series, the most important question ever asked. It is Resurrection Sunday, or more commonly known as Easter. On that day, Jesus initially appeared to only a few. First to Mary Magdalene, and then to two who were walking from Jerusalem back to Emmaus, and then finally to 10 of the apostles gathered in Jerusalem behind locked doors. Now on that first Resurrection Sunday, two of those apostles were missing. Judas, of course, because he had hung himself, and Thomas. We often call Thomas the doubter. How about changing that and knowing him as Thomas the willing? Not only was Thomas willing to ask the right questions, he gave the right answers to the most important question ever asked. Now, sometimes we just associate people with what they do. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here in Sault Ste. Marie, Neville's is the best place for meats. Ed Cook owns Neville's Superette. Because Ed is behind the butcher counter most of the time, there are many in this town who might not know that Ed's last name is Cook, but they know him as Ed the Butcher. And then there's Derek the Barber, Al the Mechanic, Gary the Cook. Can you imagine being Thomas? Can you imagine having your name tagged with being Thomas the Doubter? You are not known as Thomas the Apostle. You are not known as Thomas the servant of God, but you are known as Thomas the Doubter. Does Thomas really deserve that name? We're going to look at the life of Thomas today. Other than when the apostles were listed, Thomas is only mentioned 3 times in all of the Bible, and those 3 times occur in the Gospel of John. By looking at these 3 passages, we are going to discover a Thomas who was willing to risk his life. He was willing to ask hard questions, and he was willing to accept the truth. Now, first of all, let's understand that Thomas was willing to risk his life. The first time we hear from Thomas directly comes in John chapter 11 and verse 16. This is the passage about Lazarus being ill, Lazarus dying, and ultimately Jesus resurrecting Lazarus from the grave. Let me read that passage for you. This is John chapter 11, verses 1 through 16. Now there was a man named Lazarus who was sick. He was from Bethany, the village that Mary and her sister Martha lived in. This Mary, who was the brother of Lazarus, who lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on Jesus' feet and wiped them with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." And when he heard this, Jesus said, "It's a sickness that will not end in death. No, it is for the glory of God, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, and yet when they heard that Lazarus was sick, Jesus stayed there for a few more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and you're going to go back there?" And Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." And after he said this, he went on to tell them plainly, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." Well, the disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." And Jesus had been speaking of his death, but the disciples thought he meant a natural sleep. So then he told them again, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Now get this in verse 16. Then Thomas, called Didymus the twin, said to the rest of the disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. You see, Thomas was one who was willing to ask questions, but he was one also who was willing to risk his life. The disciples had a good point here. They said, you know, Jesus, they're looking to kill you, and going back to Judea might give your enemies the chance. But Jesus still insisted that they go. And we see verses 11 and 12 are really a little humorous. He's trying to be kind. He said, fellas, Lazarus is sleeping. And the disciples responded, well then, let's let him sleep and get better. And then Jesus had to say, okay, guys, he's not sleeping, he's dead. Pay attention, though, to Thomas's bold reply in verse 16. Then let us go and die with him. Knowing it was dangerous to go back to the Jerusalem area, Thomas was really saying, I am willing to follow you, Jesus, even if it means my death. So what can we learn from this? First of all, Thomas was not just a doubter. Thomas was one who was willing to put it all on the line. In his mind, there was a strong chance that he would be killed if he went to Judea. And Thomas was willing to risk death in order to follow Jesus. Do we have that same kind of passion? That same kind of boldness? That same desire to follow Jesus? Are we like Thomas, willing to risk our lives because of our commitment to Jesus? So we see Thomas being very brave. But secondly, in John 14, we see him willing to ask hard questions. This is the next place that Thomas is mentioned, and this comes in a very familiar passage, one that you know and I know, and one that we have all heard read quite often, especially at funeral services. These were the words of Jesus the night that he was betrayed. He said, do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms, and if it were not so, I would have told you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back, and I will take you to be with me, that you may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. And here's Thomas's question. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him. Now, I think this is pretty important for us to understand. Passages that we're familiar with, words that we have memorized. Let not your hearts be troubled. I am the way, the truth, and the life, all centered around an encounter that Thomas had with Jesus. He was willing to ask the hard questions. Jesus was giving his disciples comfort, but what he said certainly sounded confusing. I can see the apostles sitting around that table that night, nodding their heads in agreement, acting like they were pretending to understand what Jesus was saying. Yes, wasn't that astounding? But in reality, they were shaking their heads because they didn't understand. They really were confused. Now, I can tell you, after over 40 years of preaching, I've gotten that same look from people when I've said things, and I don't think they understand what I'm saying, but they smile and they nod anyway. Get this. Thomas was the only one to ask for clarification. Like a kid in a classroom, he raised his hand and he said, Lord, I don't get it. I'm confused. Can you help me understand what you just said? Now notice that Jesus didn't rebuke Thomas. Instead, he answered his honest question. He didn't make fun of him. He came at that same topic from a different angle, and he expanded on some of the things he had been teaching them to help answer that honest and sincere question. I'd bet the rest of the disciples in their minds were saying, "Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate you asking the question, because I didn't understand either." One of the biggest misconceptions we have been taught is to never ask questions. But I want you to know that honest questions are not a sin. To want to know exactly how something works is not wrong. To want to better understand a subject is not incorrect. Honest questions are not bad if we ask them. But if they're unasked, then we don't learn. There are some things we do not understand at first. I don't know about you, but I know that I am not the world's fastest thinker. It takes me a while to figure some things out. I want to be sure and not just blindly accept what I am told. While thinking through those things, I would often ask my instructor, and I'd ask myself a lot of questions so I could clarify, so that I could understand what was meant. Listen. Be willing to ask questions. Be willing to examine things, to figure out what exactly is going on. Be brave. Be willing to ask hard questions. But finally, we can follow Thomas's example in being willing to accept the truth. And this comes to us in John chapter 20, in verses 24 through 29. Now, this is where Thomas gets his bad reputation. We have to understand what was going on beforehand. On that Sunday that Jesus arose from the grave, there were startling announcements. In the morning, some of the women were brave enough to leave their locked quarters where Jesus' followers were hiding. They went to the tomb to want to finish preparing Jesus' body for burial. Breathlessly, they ran back and said that the tomb was empty and that they saw an angel who told them that Jesus was alive. Later, Mary Magdalene came back to them with an even more unbelievable message. She said that she had encountered the resurrected Jesus in that garden where he was buried, and that he had given her a message to carry back to these cowering disciples. Finally, in the evening, we see that two ran all the way back from Emmaus after having left that morning. They said that they spent the afternoon walking along the road with Jesus. And then, with the doors locked, Jesus appeared to them all. All, that is, except Judas, who had hung himself, and Thomas, who for some unexplained reason was not with them. Where was Thomas? The Bible does not say. But the following Sunday, they all tried to convince Thomas that Jesus was alive. Now let's read that passage. John chapter 20, and we'll be looking, starting at verse 24. It says that as they spoke to him, Thomas, called Didymus, was one of the 12. He was not with the disciples when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed." Wow. A personal audience with Jesus. Not just with Jesus, but with the resurrected Jesus. We see that Thomas did not want to blindly accept what his fellow disciples were saying. He wanted to be sure that everything was correct. And so the Lord showed up, and the Lord showed him. Thomas then made one of the most overlooked statements of the Bible. My Lord and my God. This statement itself is amazing. For a Jew to make a statement, to call another human being my Lord and my God, is incredible. Thomas's words could have been considered blasphemous, and they would have been punishable by death. And yet Thomas lived the rest of his life with those words on his lips and in his heart. Now, let's be honest here. We all have had our doubts. But notice something in this story. Thomas was doubting the message of his fellow disciples. But when Jesus showed up, he believed and he confessed him as Lord. Would you grip onto this on this Resurrection Sunday? Unbelief and doubt are not the same. Unbelief is deliberate denial, disobedience, rebellion, resistance, and unbelief is always condemned. Doubt is a sincere question that is sincerely answered. Since dead people don't climb out of their caskets, doubting a resurrection would not be unusual. But doubt also occurs when our hopes are dashed. It's hard to make faith fit in with the painful realities of life. Thomas watched Jesus die. He saw it with his own eyes, which is why he wanted to see the hands, and he wanted to see where the spear was thrust into his side. But how our lives are changed when instead of our hopes being dashed, our doubts are dashed. Thomas was willing to risk his life in order to follow Jesus. He was willing to ask some really hard questions. He was willing to accept the truth. And what about us? On this Resurrection Sunday, as you and I find ourselves in shuttered places, once again, we must face Pilate's question. What will I do with Jesus? And like Thomas, may we willingly give and live the right answer. You are my Lord, and you are my God. Amen.